Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for our two teams, broken WUDC
and High Chinese.
Let's welcome.
Can we get a round of applause?
Come on, we need to get some noise. Give us some support, ladies and gentlemen. This is their final night. Yeah. Okay. Where are they? Okay, I see you. Okay, one more time, ladies and gentlemen. Give a big round of applause. Woo! Make some noise. Into there. All the best. Ladies and gentlemen, are you all ready?
I am ready.
One more time. Ladies and gentlemen, are you all ready? Okay, all still eating. I know it's very hard to mention that. Why can't we use it? Well,
B, Mike. Abang B.
yeah, he's
Check.
okay. So we leave to the educators, yeah? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Before we start the grand final for the 7th Malaysian Debate Open, I would like to introduce the 7 esteemed judge panelists for this round. The first person will be Kana from Singapore, Jesus from the Philippines, Sadi Chilani from Hong Kong, Akib Hussain from Bangladesh, Bobby Andika Rutang from Indonesia, Wasifa from Bangladesh, and chairing this round will be myself, Said Sadiq. In government, we have the team for Boulevard of Broken World Dreams. Let's give them a round of applause. And in opposition, we have the High Chinese. Woo. The motion for the grand finals is: assuming the technology exists, this house will forcibly implant memories of discrimination experienced by minorities in the mind of the majority. I call this house to order, and I would like to invite the Honourable Prime Minister to start up this debate, which stands in his name.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you do.
Yes? Okay. Who's the chair? Okay. So,
This page.
okay. As we celebrate almost 200 years of the abolition of slavery, the world we live in today is a world in which an African American man is twice as likely to go to prison than to go to university. And that is a world that we regret inside government and a world we want to change as soon as we can. Our policy is very simple. We will force majorities of all kinds, ethnic, religious, language, cultural, or racial, to actually experience the memories of individuals who've been discriminated by them or the societies that they set up. Obviously, there's going to be a spectrum of memories being implanted in individuals, right? We can say it should be a three-digit spectrum. If there are people who lynch black people, for example, who will implant memories of a harsher kind of facing things like violence. The people, or a large majority of individuals who are either indifferent or do things like casual racism, will be implanted memories of things like racial discriminations, or being heard racial slurs at, being stared at a bus, or being rejected from a job because of their color. Our policy will cater for that. The first argument is, why do we think states ought to do this? We think that the fact that nation states exist is a concession to the fact that the unmitigated pursuit of self-interest is not one that we believe in. Why? Because if you look at it, if you imagine a time where states did not exist, long before governments were set up, it was a world in which individuals pursued their self-interest and their self-interest exclusively. That was a world in which minorities were oppressed. That was a world in which people who were stronger could loot and could kill and could rape. It was a world in which people lived in a fear and insecurity of being robbed or lynched by a person who was stronger than them. In a world in which we recognize that we set up nation states was a world in which we recognized that the protection of the collective was something that was important, and we traded off the right to pursue our self-interest exclusively. We think that the fact that nation states exist and ought to exist, and if that's the world we ought to prefer, is a world where this policy must exist. But we do recognize that there are limits between the pursuit of a collective interest and self-interest, right? But we think in those instances, this deadlock is broken by the extent to which individuals are harmed by the passing of certain policy. What do we mean by this? In a world in which the cost to individuals who are being forced to feel this memory is minute. The fact that the cost of feeling guilty for being a racist or feeling bad for being racially slurred at is far minimal as compared to the massive change that you can bring to the lives of poor black African American individuals who are either racially abused or physically lynched or cannot go to university. So it is true that there's a balance of rights in this instance, because we think the prioritization of the rights of those who are disadvantaged in our community is far more important. Before I go on, yeah.
So these memories that you implant, do they become the memory of the implantee with the self as the subject of discrimination or not?
Yes, they do become the subject of the discrimination or placed in a scenario where they feel the discrimination firsthand, right? Let's look at what do states already do this, right? Because we will contend that states already provide protections for minorities in places where we recognize that democracies aren't perfect. So in situations where we recognize that majority rule isn't always the best, we have things often like constitutional protections for minorities, which people cannot change even by a democratic will. Right? We have things like redistributive taxation, where states intervene to solve structural problems which may inhibit the ability of minorities to live a meaningful life. We think our policy is extremely similar. We think states ought to pursue policies which correct the structural barriers which prevent people of certain ethnicities or classes from actually living a life that they ought to be able to live. The second argument is, why do we feel empathy is important, and why do we think it lacks? We don't think inside government that humans are naturally unempathetic. But we think that it's often societal constructs in which they live which force them to become unempathetic with individuals who they cannot connect with. The fact that you're far more likely to be empathetic to a white woman who is raped by a black man, but not be empathetic towards that black man whose societal upbringing may have forced him into a situation which committed that crime is something that's problematic. Why are individuals more likely to, for example, empathize with people they are closer to? There are often societal structures like things like the fact that racists often live in segregated regions. Maybe may cause the fact that you've never actually interacted with someone who's from a different ethnicity or race, and you can never actually understand their problems. You've often been to different schools. The fact that you often belong to different social circles. The fact that you often never actually placed yourself in the shoes of this individual means that you're never actually able to recognize what his problems are. And in a world in which you have the power to change policy and affect the life of these people, you're fundamentally incapable of ever recognizing what is needed to solve these problems. The fact that a white person, or as a father, can never actually realize what it means, but suddenly be rejected from a job because of his color, is what we face individuals by our policy with. We force people who are both actively racist or indifferent towards racial segregation to face what it feels like, or the trauma that is felt by individuals who's racially discriminated either by an individual or by society, and we spur them on to action, Mr. Speaker. We actually think criminals, in this instance being large majorities who discriminate against minorities, should be able to feel the impact of that crime, Mr. Speaker, to be able to feel the way that they destroy the lives of these individuals for no reason. And we think people who are indifferent towards these races will be far more likely to support things like affirmative action in instances that they actually feel this. What are the impacts of our policy, right? The first thing that I would like to say is that it destroys the notion in the minds of majorities that minorities often exaggerate problems, right? And this is the number one opposition that you often have to things like affirmative action or rights for ethnic minorities. The fact that a majority often say that these people are exaggerating their problems and often do not deserve rights we often extend to them or don't deserve further rights. We think the fact that you actually understand the world they come from means that you're far less likely to either fall for this defense or make this defense a terrible one in political discussion. But secondly, it destroys the notion that you yourself are a victim if you're a majority. What do I mean by this? People often support things like affirmative action policies unless it becomes the day that they are rejected from university in the favor of a black applicant, right? It is that day that white teenager says that we ought not to support rights for these individuals because he's targeted me and as community as a whole has targeted my ability to go to university. Why is that true? It is true because first, he doesn't actually recognize the problems of this individual, but secondly, he's naturally predisposed to preference himself as a product of the way that humans often exist in society. We actually try and place a higher burden on him, try to empathize with individuals who actually face these problems. But thirdly, it destroys indifference, Mr. Speaker, we think is extremely important. Because we think large majorities of people in the world today aren't actively racist, but are indifferent toward problems of race. We think we actually feel those people. We push those people to try and feel something about race and the fact that racial problems exist. It is not a coincidence, Mr. Speaker, that us debaters in this room are far more empathetic towards things like racial discrimination or discrimination against sexual orientation or language because we're on a daily basis faced with those issues. We then try to face the larger majority of people in the world who are either indifferent toward these issues or because of social upbringing can never actually understand what these issues feel like. It's a way of trying to force these people into political action. We think a world in which a majority of people are making decisions which affect the lives of people who they are not in contact with or can never understand the problems of is a world we should not live in. We want to confront the majority with either the implications of their decision or the indifference which is truly proud to propose.
We thank that speaker for his speech. Without further ado, let's invite the leader of opposition.
Indeed, as we celebrate 200 years since the abolition of slavery, we need to recognize one thing. That insofar as these people were taken up as slaves, what they are trying to do and proposing is that they want to create a new kind of slavery, a slavery or a mental slavery that the government is able to foist on people by altering and erasing their identities for the sake of some sort of state-sponsored goal. We think these things are horrific, and we are going to talk about this on 3 levels. One, we're going to tell you why exactly they completely erode the value of life and what makes life meaningful to begin with, making the kind of utopia that they are talking about completely meaningless. Secondly, we're going to tell you why it's terrible for the people that are involved and why it opens up the doors for abuse by the state. And thirdly, we're going to tell you why this is actually counterproductive. They don't actually get the kind of equality that they want to speak of. The rebuttals will be intertwined. One, let's talk about what makes life meaningful, right? We think that what's important and we need to recognize today is that every single individual and every single person is a person and values and treasures their identity because the memories that are central to them. That your ability to craft and determine your own life and your identity and the way in which you want to view the world is something that we celebrate as the bastion of humanity. That the mind is the last bastion of common humanity, the last and only bastion of humanity that we could potentially possess. What they are saying is they want to destroy and subvert this subjective experience for their own ends. We think what they essentially do is cause an erosion of self. What they are essentially proposing, no thank you, is an identity genocide. We don't think that the mind is a vessel of state indoctrination, right? And the reason why we even have laws to begin with to ensure that things like discrimination don't exist is because we think that these laws exist to protect the subjective experiences of these people to begin with, right? That we want to ensure that the subjective experience of people is not destroyed to the extent that they lose their sense of self. What they want to do is ensure that everyone loses, no thank you, that particular sense of self. itself, we think that is problematic. We accept and acknowledge that when we defend an individual's right to liberty and the right to choose for themselves what they want to do, that to some extent some people are messed up. They will abuse it. The problem here, no thank you, is that when you forcibly try to force these people or force these memories upon them, you lose the very meaning of the utopia that you are standing for. One, we tell you that things have improved, right? That humanity has progressed somewhat over the years. That the way in which we did it is through communication, by reaching out to our common man and recognizing the kind of subjective experiences that they had to go through and understanding why we need to treat them with a fairness and common humanity. We don't think the way to try and do this is by forcing these memories on these individuals, because we think you destroy the ability or you destroy the meaning for that to begin with. A utopia at the end of the day is when we all recognize our common humanity and are able to suffer our own pleasures for the sake of others. No, thank you, madam. We think they lose their particular meaning. So if you could just imagine yourself being forced to remember things that were never part of your life, to have someone else dictate for you what exactly should be prioritized in your life, or implant these memories that were never part of your identity and never shaped you, we think that is massively horrible in that sense. Yes.
Considering that there are not only environmental but also cultural and geographical limitations to how much you can empathize and understand another individual, how are you going to achieve this sudden utopia under the side of opposition?
We're not saying that we want a sudden utopia, and to begin with, we don't think that utopia will materialize, which we'll talk about later. But more importantly, we think that the way we should do it is the way that we've always done it, right? Like, you look at the way that humanity has progressed so far, we do it by interacting with other human beings and recognizing the need to be better to these people. We don't think that it's an impossible goal for them. But why is it even worse? And here we move on to the second argument for today, right? Why we think that this is fundamentally a horrible thing to put onto these people. One, they never actually clearly define to us who exactly is going to get these memories. Because if you think about it, oppression is intersectional. Every single individual faces some measure of oppression in their life, whether or not you are a majority. So for instance, a male nerd, for instance, that goes on to become successful in the future, when he was still a young teenage child, also faced the oppression of individuals looking at him as a non-sexual being, or the kind of oppression that comes about from police, for instance. But under their model, this individual will be foisted on the memories of everybody else, but these memories will not be foisted on the minority, because this is not seen as a legitimate form of oppression. We think that is problematic. But secondly, we also think the reason why this is problematic is because if you just think about it, individuals who, thank you, don't want to lose their sense of self. So what happens under their world is that individuals are going to reject this policy. And this means that for their policy to work, the state has to literally forcibly drag these people into rooms and implant these memories into them. We think that is massively horrible to begin with. But the second problem in this scenario is that we need to recognize that what people see as good, or what a state tries, the kind of oppression that the state will try to implant in these people's minds, and what they see to be unfairness is a product of time. That what is oppression now and what is discrimination now was not discrimination in the past, and vice versa. This means that the kind of memories that they're going to be implanting, no thank you, are going to change over time. But why is this essentially problematic? Because we think at the end of the day, the person who most defines what is oppression is the state. So for instance, in Singapore, the state is not going to think the ideas of things like poverty or being of a lower social class is a problem. Because in Singapore, the values of meritocracy dictate that this is not real oppression, that you can work hard to get out of it. We think that is fundamentally problematic, because at the end of the day, the state is now the one who is able to choose what kind of discrimination is legitimate and what kind of discrimination should be corrected. We think that that particular power is not something that we want to support. No, thank you. Now, why is it that we don't think their policy will work? There are a few reasons for it, right? One, we think that when you're talking about when you implant these memories to people, the first possible reaction is that these individuals feel as if these are not their real memories, and as a result, they just look at it academically and it doesn't actually change anything. But the second problem is if these people feel as if they really were the subject of their oppression. We think that problem now is that given that they think discrimination is so bad and every single individual should not be a subject of discrimination, why then are they forcing every single individual to be a subject of that particular discrimination? We think what they are doing is essentially causing these people to be raped, causing these people to have their family members murdered, causing these people to be a form of escapism. Why is this so? If you were subject to discrimination from the moment of birth, we think that you have spent your entire life trying to be able to cope with discrimination or finding sanctuaries or ways in which you escape your life. The problem now is that what happens is that these individuals are foisted all at once with all these kind of memories with absolutely no way of learning how to cope with it. We don't think they actually solve the problem, but what actually happens is they force these people into a route of escapism which doesn't actually change anything. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we tell you, abolish slavery.
We thank the Speaker for his speech. We would now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I didn't expect that in a final of MBO, I would have to get up here and make the statement that having an identity that is based on discriminating against other people and taking away the rights of those people to actualize their identity is an illegitimate identity for the state to protect. And that's where I want to start this speech. I'm going to talk about the major contention that was like not just model bashing from the opposition. Let's question whether or not this is the state creating slavery of the mind. The first problem with this argument is that it presumes your identity is based on some pure interpretation of you as a human being and is not a product of the myriad of social circumstances in which you are raised. The suggestion that you wanting to live as a bigot is somehow a natural expression of who you would be in a world in which we didn't already face bigotry, in a world in which we didn't already normalize you being supremacist because you happen to be white over an African American is preposterous. The suggestion that individuals' identity is not a construction of the various things they face, the messages that they hear from their peers, the messages that they are constantly forced to hear and intellectualize from the media, from the government, from any number of powerful authorities in a society who sends out a multitude of different messages. So what is the pure identity of a human being that the opposition are actually attempting to protect in this debate? I would argue that it doesn't exist. And in a world in which power structures shape your identity, the question then has to be, how do we remove that? How do we redress that? We think we liberate people from being racist. We don't think people are naturally inclined to be racist. We think they are racist by virtue of a number of social structures that you condemn them to continue to live under. So don't get up here and moralize to me that you're the team that protects the pure and good-hearted identity of humanity. Preposterous. But secondly, even if I'm willing to accept that the identity that people have is a representation of who they are and who they ought to be, I'm also willing to suggest that in instances where that means meaningful, tangible, concrete harms to people who cannot defend themselves, that's an identity I don't care about. Let me give you an extreme but I think relevant analogy. If it is critical to your identity to rape other people, would you prevent people from raping? Of course you would, because this debate is a balance of various people's rights. To the extent that this might impinge upon your capacity to construct your identity as a racist or as a bigot or as somebody who hates people by virtue of the gender that they have or the sexuality that they have, I am willing to live in that world. I'm willing to live in a world that says some identities are wrong, and we think, and this like literally goes ignored in the opposition leader's speech, we think that's exactly the principle of democracy, that you do not get to pursue what's in your own best interest without ever having to be forced to counterbalance that with what's in the best interest of the collective. Because principally speaking, I presume they would prefer to live in a world in which you never had to consider what was best for anybody else, in which you could run around and do whatever it was that you liked, because that was the pure expression of your identity. The final thing I want to say about identity, what about the identity of every single minority who for decades upon centuries has never been able to do the things that are meaningful to them? If you're a homosexual living in today's society who cannot get married, who cannot publicly express the love you have for another human being, who has to constantly defend yourself and face discrimination, what is your identity, Mr. Speaker? It is ridiculous that they suggest that we should preference the identities of those who are in positions of power that are arbitrary over people who face day-to-day discrimination, have awful lives as a result. Go ahead.
How far are you willing to alter the human mind to remove these existing
Oh my
policies?
goodness. Okay, great. So I've dealt with the substantive part of their case, and now I'll deal with their critiques of our model. First of all, they say, how will you do this? Will it be their memories, or will it be a TV show they watch? Will they be able to opt in? Will they be able to opt out? These are inconsequential questions, but I'll answer them regardless. Yes, we think the state ought to force people to do this. Yes, we think the state can also do it subliminally and not tell people they're a question, at the end of that, the cumulative assessment of this policy has to be, is the world better when people are forced to engage with these things? Because, and here gets their final claim, discrimination changes over time. So historically, it was wrong to discriminate against people on the basis of certain things, and that has changed. Exactly. And that's the reason why any state policy that intends to engender empathy within people is the solution. Because as an empathetic person who is capable of engaging with the positions and the lives and the preferences of people who live around you, you are far more likely to recognize discrimination in the future. You are far more likely as an ethnic minority to to want to support policies that preference other people who face discrimination by virtue of the fact that you have an increased sense of empathy. So again, that really wasn't a meaningful critique of this policy. We created a world where people were more empathetic, which means at the point at which discrimination occurred, they were more capable of recognizing it, they were more likely to do something about it as a result. We think they need to at some point defend the fact that they're willing to arbitrarily preference the comfort levels of people who are in positions of power, white, rich males, over every single other person in society. The final quib they have is everybody faces discrimination. So why is it fair to subject people to this policy? If the best you've got is the claim that a white, rich male faces discrimination because he happens to be a nerd, and they're somehow equivalent to the discrimination faced by people of colour, faced by people of sexual or religious minorities, you will lose this debate. We are happy to suggest that we ought to equalise those things. We are happy to suggest that you ought to face discrimination or remember discrimination that is in some way equivalent to the horrific lives that these types of actual minorities face on a day-to-day basis. Then they say, if discrimination is so wrong, why do you want to force it on everyone? Because, and here's the kicker, we are not forcing each of these people to live through discrimination for every single day of the rest of their life. We are giving them memories so that they can empathise. You want to live in a world where minorities are forced to go through actual, practical discrimination every single day of their lives. We're willing to say that those two things do not balance out in this debate. In this debate, what is the outcome of our policy? The outcome of our policy is to ensure that in a democratic society, one where you necessarily, in order for that society to function and not become a tyranny of the majority, have to be able to empathise and understand the plight of people within your society and around you. We create a society where you're more likely to do that. We create a society where you're more likely to vote for a party that preferences minority rights at the minimal cost to yourself. That you're more likely to not exclusively preference things like what is the best economic situation for you at the cost of every single poor person who has to live a horrific and terrible life. Basing your identity on discriminating against other people is illegitimate, we propose.
We thank that speaker for his speech. We now would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Is this good? This? Yes? Okay. So I mean, in the government's world, I stand to have some portion of my memories wiped, potentially, and rewritten and reshaped in favor of some other narrative that will cause me to internalize some level of trauma. All of the sin of having happened to be born in an ethnic majority in a country where being Chinese is in the ethnic majority. I think that's problematic. I think I haven't constructed my identity around being a discriminatory, elitist, racist, sexist person. And I admit that sometimes I may be one or many of these things, in the same way that you and I are probably imperfect and are sometimes capable of doing things that are bad. That does not mean that I lose the ability to be a person with full control over how I define myself and how I think about things in my own mind, the last seat of human freedom. They were unwilling to engage with it. I'm going to talk about three things in this thing. One, I'm going to talk about how people are likely to respond to this model post-injection of memory. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the limits of state intervention and which sort of identities we want to protect. Lastly, I'm going to talk about how to be human. First question, how do people respond to this? We thought to tell us that it is unimportant to discuss the details of the model might, I guess, be slightly fair in a motion which is super science fiction and technical. But we thought it was problematic because not dealing with the details of how these memories are likely to be implanted means that you don't deal with the realities of what happens when you put thoughts that are new into people's heads. People are likely, possibly, to possess great deals of dissonance with those thoughts, possess psychic breaks with those thoughts, that prevent them from being able to interpret these new memories in a way that is as good as the ways in which we interpret new experiences, unencumbered by the limitations of scientific fantasy. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we thought that to the extent to which we were willing to insert potentially traumatic or oppressive experiences into people, the way people was likely to respond wasn't in the good fashion that they believed in, which is presumably that if you have gone through an unpleasant experience yourself, you are going to empathize with other people who also go through unpleasant and discriminatory experiences. We think that's not true because the vast majority of people at some level, or the vast majority of the most problematic people that they wanted to talk about, are likely to be base, which means that when you have a discriminatory memory in a moment, which shows you to be the target of someone, which shows you to be harmed by someone, what your likely response is to want to inflict harm against that person or that group of person, which means you only perpetuate a cycle of discrimination and unpleasantness. But before I go,
we accept that perhaps a rich, white male person might suffer the discomfort of some cognitive dissonance. But why is that not worth him finally being able to consider groups of people he will never consider in his life without this policy?
Yeah, so that's what I was on, the potential trade-offs against this policy. And I'm going to get on to why I think their form of consideration isn't a good form of consideration. But what we told you, returning to what I was talking about, was that first you're likely to perpetuate a cycle of repeated discrimination and counter-discrimination because the first instinct of someone who is hurt is to lash out against the person who has hurt them. That's why often people who are discriminated against or who are bullied, who want to discriminate against or to bully other people in their lifetimes, they perpetuate their cycle of harm and of hatred. We think that's the likely reaction to someone who gets this new traumatic experience in their minds. That was especially problematic because these new and traumatic experiences are going to flood in and be injected and inserted very suddenly. Most of us, when we are discriminated against, when I've experienced discrimination, are able to internalize and cope with that over long periods of time. That doesn't happen in their model when presumably you're presented with a long range of traumatic experiences without the ability of living long years of experience to manage that process of coping. That was a harm on their side. The last thing we told about the effect of their policy was to tell us they will make people more empathetic. The problem here was that they didn't understand what empathy was. What empathy is about other people. It's about speaking to a different person, trying to understand his or her experiences in the communicative process that exists between you and that other person. What they did instead is focus the empathy on yourself. So that wasn't empathy because you were just thinking about your own experiences. Nothing about knowing that you were experiencing being discriminated meant that you were more likely to be empathetic with a different person, especially when their solution presumably suggested that normal empathetic solutions like talking to other people were bad. So their policy and their stance in general suggests that a recourse to scientific injections and a recourse to focusing yourself on your own experiences is the way to fight racism and discrimination. We thought that wasn't empathy. Okay, second question, the limits of state intervention. So in Mitra, they tell us that the state intervenes in many ways in which you express your identity, and that was also something that Jamal said. The difference here is that we were limiting the ways in which you express your identity via the law, which Shermaine already told you about. We circumscribe your actions. We circumscribe your actions to protect the identities of the people who you might potentially harm with those actions. So there's a fundamental difference between these two things. We thought that we were happy to protect the identities of terrible people and the abilities of these terrible people to self-define themselves as terrible because that was who they were as human beings. We were also happy in the same breath to limit their ability to be terrible to other people. No, this is something that's fundamentally human, and that is my next question. We need to protect that fundamental humanness. The last thing we wanted to say about this idea of expressions of identity versus the identity that is central to yourself is that if you are in a position of power and that you are discriminatory or and so on and so forth, is that your identity doesn't deserve to be protected. We thought that was preposterous. And I'm going to answer that in my last question on how to be human. So, I think Shermaine talked a lot about this, but they were pretty glib about ignoring it because presumably they don't care about the fact that you and I both are people because of the experiences we've gone through, the memories we have, and the memories we have define who we are. Now, what they're going to say, presumably next, is if your memories define who you are, we put new memories into you, then that defines your actions in a way that is positive. The problem here is, we think, the ability to not have your memories and yourself tampered with by the state, an organ of great power and with uncertain provenance, with uncertain goodness, is something that's very important. The ability to live, to remember, to reshape our experiences, each of which is crucial to who we are, is important. And they were happy to do away with all of them. Why are these things important to us? Because what makes us human is our ability to be conscious and our ability to reassess who we are in every given moment. To think about the memories that of things we did in the past, and these memories, and think about how that makes us the sum total of who we want to be today. If you take that away, if you take that the ability to have full control over what's going on in your own mind, this seat of humanity, you are taking away the ability of humans to be human. Mr. Speaker, is the world better in our world? It was because we did more to create empathy and because we didn't destroy the freedom to be human. Proud photos.
We thank that speaker for his speech. I would like to invite Government Whip.
Ladies and gentlemen, we thought under the side of government that it was uncontroversial to say that your personality and your identity was the sum of your experiences and some of the exposures that you had growing up as an individual in society. And we think that it's uncontroversial to say that individuals that exist as bigots, racists in society today would rather not be racist and bigots given different circumstances that they would have grown up with. Fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, we think that there's been a fundamental failure on the side of opposition to critically and principally engage with us in regards to how individuals formulate their identities, and their identities are not these pure ethereal concepts that individuals are inherently born with but are fundamentally manufactured not only by society but also the state. That is why we must propose. Ladies and gentlemen, first, before I go to the issues in regards to, firstly, how do we then create the empathy necessary and whether or not opposition necessarily has enough of alternatives to create the empathy? And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, I'll look at how indifference, or rather than active discrimination, perpetuates discriminatory norms. Firstly, let's talk about the principle of this debate. I've already covered this a little bit when I've talked about how a sense of self and a sense of identity is a manufactured concept, ladies and gentlemen. But one thing that I think the opposition failed to engage with us on is in regards to the scale of harm that oftentimes state prioritizes your rights on in many circumstances, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that the biggest harm that the opposition could point to in this debate was the sense of discomfort and cognitive dissonance that an average, white, privileged, rich, white person, ladies and gentlemen, felt whenever he had to be confronted with a situation that he was uncomfortable with, for example, actually seeing a black person in poverty or actually seeing a black person in his community, ladies and gentlemen. In those circumstances, we are willing to say that the minuscule discomfort that you feel on a psychological level does not outweigh the fact that your choices oftentimes offset or even instigate the kind of discrimination that you face in society as a minority group every single day of your lives. Fundamentally, those harms that minority groups face every day, ladies and gentlemen, are fundamentally more important for us to consider in this debate. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, they told us it's unfair on a principle level. I was never complicit, I never engaged in these structures, and therefore, I should never be subjected to the discrimination that was faced by these individuals. Firstly, I'd like to say to this, that this is an assuming technology debate. So presumably we're not going to inject memories that will screw up a person's mind to such a significant extent, perhaps opposition wants to be a little bit more generous in terms of how the policy will operate. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, this policy of course works in a scale, as already told you by Aditya. I think it's reasonable to say that an individual that's fairly reasonable, fairly undiscriminatory towards minority groups will not need an excessive amount of active injection of memories in order for him to be balanced in his view of minority groups. But what's the counterfactual? The counterfactual is, if we are talking about actively discriminatory individuals in society, then obviously we think it's necessary for you to inject some degree of excessive memory, ladies and gentlemen, in order to change their minds, ladies and gentlemen. Because what were the alternatives they provide us under that side of the house in order to change these individuals' minds? Not much. Whether it be the current strains of progress that we've seen in today's society, never really telling us what were the motivating factors behind these progresses, ladies and gentlemen. Fundamentally, we think it was insufficient for them to say that you will leave it up to chance for these bigots to just change themselves. Now, let's talk about empathy under the side of government. Firstly, I don't think they ever wanted to engage with us in regards to the structural inability of many people to actively engage in empathetic behavior or understanding of minority groups. Whether it be geographical limitations, when white South Africans in Cape Town don't actually see the black slums and the shanty towns that black people live in South Africa, disabling them from understanding the plight of the poor. Whether it be limited cultural exposure when it comes to things as innocuous as discriminating an individual for language barriers or having a funny accent during a job interview. Or even, ladies and gentlemen, something as subtle and something as insidious as odd stares, or even the hushed whispers that you walk through crowds with whenever they see you being an oddball out, whenever a Mexican walks through a white community. These things are incremental but also actively discriminating towards individuals that an average middle-class white person will never have to face in his life and will never have to confront in his active everyday discrimination. This necessarily means there is a structural barrier in terms of what people can empathize with that necessitates this policy, ladies and gentlemen. But before I go any further, yes, sir.
So we accept that our identities are influenced by a wide range of experiences. But the key here is that we remain individually the principal agents who construct our identity. The state doesn't come in to inject things into our minds.
Of course, and that's why we say that you may keep your own identities, you may keep your own memories, but you need to consider your own memories in contrast of everybody else's memories and everybody else's concerns in these circumstances. Now, I'm going to take the side of opposition at its best, ladies and gentlemen. That let's assume that you can change society and there are some forces at work to change society. I have two responses. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's unacceptably slow in terms of the progress that they can claim on that side of the house. The fact that today, ladies and gentlemen, in the United States of America, African Americans are more incarcerated than the time of slavery shows that we have shown an incredibly slow progress in terms of equality towards different minority groups in society. But secondly, I'd like to say that this societal progress on opposition is fragile and susceptible to the pendulum of public opinion in society, ladies and gentlemen. All it takes is one white girl to be raped by a black boy in a community and sensationalized by the media, ladies and gentlemen, to sway public opinion in a large extent. At the very least, under our side, the comparative is people have an idea and a memory of their own to contrast their reactions and their memories to stymie or to regulate and moderate their own reactions in those circumstances. Under their side, only societal prejudice dictates their reactions, ladies and gentlemen. Fundamentally, on a principle level, as well as on a practical level, ladies and gentlemen, individuals are fundamentally sometimes unable to empathize with minority groups. That's no fault of their own, but it certainly doesn't mean that we shouldn't protect and shouldn't take active steps to ensure that minority groups in this zero-sum game that we call life, ladies and gentlemen, aren't protected. We are exceedingly proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for his speech. Without further ado, let's invite the opposition whip.
So I'm going to do the Nobel thing and take our opponents at their best. And at their best, what they're fostering is not love, forgiveness, and empathy. It is instead trauma, resentment, hatred, and self-loathing. Because they can shape our memories to make us experience the trauma of being discriminated against, but not how we subjectively interpret those things. We told you right from the start that it's easy for human beings to cave in to our base tendencies, to retaliate and lash out like a wounded animal, further hurting those around us once the seeds of discord and hatred have been planted in our minds and allowed to bloom. But it's difficult to master the courage and humanity to forgive and forget, to be the better man. And that's why we didn't think it was a good idea to introduce this world of hatred to lots of people and then to claim that it will magically make us better people. Because their claim was that just because we were once hurt, we would never subject other people to the same pain. But very often the reverse applies. That's why people who were bullied from a young age, very often, like once they grow raging hormones and suddenly become like muscular men, then become bullies themselves. We say the same very often occurs with rapists who had been violated when they were young. The thing then is that the long journey to empathy requires genuine person-to-person contact, conversation, heart-to-heart talk, the introspection that Nelson Mandela did, for example, that we claim cannot meaningfully be replaced by an artificially state-constructed drama, which we say, like state-constructed porn, is probably bad and cheesy propaganda. So what we need to then understand is that it's very easy to traumatize people, but it's hard to force them to then manage that pain. And we think what they are doing is conditioning people to a world of discrimination, right? Check your tracking. They never explain why hatred begets empathy. They simply asserted it through how, that somehow it will magically appear. That's not empirical. If you look at empirical evidence of cycles of violence between Muslims and Christians, the Sunnis and the Shiites, the Hutus and the Tutsis, the truth is that the experience of discrimination often ends up in a self-perpetuating cycle. Let's move on to the next thing, right, where we discuss what makes life meaningful, which in my opinion is more interesting, right? So their claim was, it would be good if people didn't discriminate, perhaps also if they donated to charity, perhaps also if they were vegetarian and stopped killing poor animals. But all these things, we would claim, are secondary to human agency and experience. Because understand this, life is not just a unique subjective experience. It is the unique subjective experience. It is all that we will ever have, and yet no two of us have the same. Right? What do they say to that? They say, oh, but identities that are shaped around hurting others are not worth protecting. Let's examine this statement, right? So we do agree to a certain extent that's the case. That's why we make rape illegal. That's why we think we should pass anti-discrimination laws and encourage positive norms. But you also need to consider the fact that Misal himself acknowledged and conceded that he hasn't actually stopped people from discriminating against others or constructing their identity around being a bigot. All they've done is injected some memories of being discriminated against. So Gemma's rant about how these identities were not worth protecting missed the point, because that wasn't what we were trying to protect. What we were trying to protect is the state from trying to redefine and reprogram us into someone that we simply weren't, right? That they don't simply, like, that they don't simply erase your experiences of being oppressive, but they in effect actively oppress you. We think this was a harm that was relevant, right? Just as it's not okay for me to trample on the dignity of Gemma and then tell her what she said just now at verbatim. Yeah, it's not like it's going to happen every day, right? We don't think it's any better for the state to then subject us to that harm and use that claim response. But beyond that, we think the logical conclusion of governance stance is that we can be reprogrammed to be incapable of malice and to become a moral human being, and somehow that would be better. Why did they say that was the case? Because they said that there was an alternative to being always influenced by external factors. Anyway, the line of logic was this: because we are affected by external factors, therefore we are manufactured by society. Gap. Therefore, the state can manufacture us in whatever way they so like. The difference between is that in status quo, our souls or our principal agency are still the principal agent through which we negotiate those experiences. In that, yes, I'm influenced by my surroundings, but I get to craft my identity in response to those surroundings, and through my agency also get to change those surroundings that affect other people. By injecting memories in the individual, by overwriting my past, you destroy that part of me. We say this is akin to large-scale identity genocide, where you turn everyone in effect some sort of model XG 1, 2, 3, 4 something. Like where they're all the same, and where all powers are replaced by something that's injected to us by the state rather than who we truly are. Yes, all three of you.
Okay. Given Jan acknowledged that your memories are a product of the birth lottery and random things that take place, can you finally defend why those memories ought to construct your identity, not just assert that they do construct your identity?
Wait, hang on. Like I just said, the difference is that the importance is that you get to exercise agency over your identity. So it's not entirely external anyway. But let's move on to the next thing, where I tell you why we should keep faith in humanity. Centuries ago, slavery was the norm. Women's consent wasn't a thing. We live in a state of anarchy where men kill each other for fish. Today, we stand as friends to debate about how to solve problems in our imperfect world without being worried about being hated. I would call that progress. So give ourselves a pat on the back, because we are not purely a product of our circumstances. We don't simply recreate those circumstances, but we do have the humanity and agency to change those things. That against all odds of geography and cultural differences, we have moved forward without forsaking who we truly are, without losing what it means to be human. So you can say I am a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday I will find us, and the world will be as one.
We thank the speaker for the song, that speech. Without further ado, I would like to invite the opposition reply speaker.
Despite my inability to sing in tune, I too dream of a better world. What was a better world in this debate? I would ask two questions. One, what happens when we inject the notions of injustice into people's minds? Two, why was being human important in this debate, and why was that the greatest harm that we were unwilling to violate? First question, what happens when we inject injustice into people's minds? What happened in this debate was they said, we are going to give people these very traumatic memories, and then some of which will not be very traumatic, some of which will be.
Thank you.
And then they're going to become good people because they are now less likely to firstly exaggerate the experiences of these people who they didn't know previously, and secondly, they're less likely to think that they are more victims than these other people. We thought those were best quite marginal effects vis-a-vis the likelihood of backlash against trauma. And why was that? What we told you was one, either these memories were likely to be incredibly traumatic, which were things that we wouldn't wish upon anyone, because if you have the experience of being violently beaten in a street corner because of your skin color, or you now have the memory of being raped, that is as good as you having undergone that. So that was trauma that we wouldn't wish on anyone, even the worst possible. But some cases, of course, they told us that we wouldn't actually be this bad. In which case, we thought the effects were likely to be minimal. But more important, what we also told you from the beginning, was that people were pigs. They weren't likely
to respond to events within their mind with such a positive outlook. They were more likely to be to lash against this in a counterproductive fashion, in the same way that bullies become the bully over and over again. What we then told you was something else. We told you that their claims of promoting empathy via this model of injecting things into your mind was inherently flawed, and they had no response to this, because we told you that empathy, like Alfred said, had to be about the communications between one person and another person, between the ability to know that other person's mind in that indirect human fashion. They told us instead, their policy instead put things into people's minds, which was tantamount to navel gazing. The focus of these experiences was always the self and never the other, which meant that true empathy was utterly impossible. They of course claim that their model was better in terms of providing more information or a wider possible range of experiences than any one of us individually could access. We thought that was true, but insofar as they never give us a link as to why accessing these experiences in the specific way that the model demands was actually going to lead to people becoming more empathetic or not lash out against these agents of discrimination, we didn't think that was relevant to this debate. The next question then was why being human was important. They were very clear about the willingness to circumscribe things we thought were central to our identity. We told you that state intervention has limits, that we're very willing to limit the expressions of your identity or your actions, which constrains other people's identities or their expressions of identity. But we weren't willing, as states, to limit the agency of individuals, because the direct transgression of a state into a person's mind is a direct violation of who that person is. Their response was, but who you are isn't really who you are, because all we are products of circumstance, that we are the sum total of experiences that are outside us. We are the sum total of these experiences. We have a crucial role to play in shaping and defining what these experiences are, and which experiences matter to us, and which experiences do not. That was something that was taken away from us when the state wants to step in, put things into our minds, and say, this experience matters to you. And if it doesn't, we'll put it back in, presumably. The mind was the seat of consciousness, and the reason why we respect human beings as individual and inviolate to begin with was because that consciousness needed to be untouched and left free from state intervention. They were very happy to throw that harm away in the hope of making the world a better place. We were very happy to oppose.
We thank the speaker for his speech. And the grand final, I would like to invite the government reply speaker.
Given the philosophical nature of today's debate, I think it's only right that I start my reply by reminding you of the thought experiment of John Rawls, who said that if we all lived in the original position, if we were behind a veil of ignorance, and we didn't know who we would be when we entered society, we didn't know if we'd be rich, we didn't know if we'd be white, we didn't know if we'd be male, every single person would opt for an equal society. If there is one true humanity in today's debate and in the world, that is equality. So the suggestion from the opposition throughout this debate that your soul determines what you believe was insufficient. I want to talk first about people's right to memories and humanity. They said, in response to our continued analysis about how people are the product of circumstances through which they live, they said yes. However, they have agency to interact with those things and determine the person that will result. And literally their claim was based on the existence of a soul through which all of those things that occurred in your life could somehow be interpreted and then acted upon. We were willing to take the hard line in this debate and suggest that free will is a construct, that at the point at which you are educated from almost the day of your birth in a society where the education system teaches you things, where your parents teach you things, where your peers have preferences, where the media that you're exposed to on a day-to-day basis teaches you to believe certain things about other people, that you don't have agency over the person you become. And that's where the opposition fell apart in today's debate with the is-or fallacy. The fact that you right now were a product of the experiences that you had was not a reason that we ought to celebrate the fact that you are constrained to be the person your experiences make you. Because we believe that every human being at their core would want a world in which discrimination did not exist. We don't believe that people's souls make them bad. We don't believe that people are born bigots or rapists or murderers. We believe those things are the fault of society, and we were willing to suggest that the state ought to have a role in changing them. So the question you have to ask yourself, which actor is more legitimate in influencing and determining the way in which humans develop? Is it people's parents? Is it the media? Is it every other influence that they acknowledge? Or is it the democratic state who is given the right and whose inception is based upon their capacity to protect the best interests of individuals? The only defense they mounted was that these people weren't complicit in discrimination and therefore they had a right to remain their identity, without acknowledging that they protected people who did discriminate on a day-to-day basis, and they said they protected people whose complicity existed when they allowed discrimination to take place around them, and they ignored it in favour of what was best for those individuals. That's why people didn't have a right to a dysfunctional identity that wasn't theirs to begin with. So what did the world look like at the end of this debate? According to Yarn, empathy is about recognising your commonality with other human beings. That's exactly right. So what did we do in this debate? We made every human being share the common experience of what it feels like to be discriminated against on the basis of arbitrary characteristics that you cannot change about yourself. And for a team that claimed they were generous when Alfred said he would take us at our best, they never engaged with the world that we set up, in which not everybody had to have the memory of being brutally raped and punished and harmed as a result of being discriminated against, in which those things were proportionate. So at the end of this debate, their major claim was that trauma would beget additional racism or additional bigotry. The reason it wouldn't is because at the point at which you recognise that hurting a person back is the same as the harm that you faced, we think you would be less likely to do it. We pointed you to the fact that across the world, people who are more empathetic, people who do in actual fact vote for policies that are more likely to help others, are those who themselves have been the victim of discrimination. The world that we live in is one in which people are more empathetic. It's by no means perfect, but it's better than a world that suggests your identity is legitimate at the point at which it's based on harming other people who propose.
We thank the speaker for the speech. We thank both teams for the debate. The judges will leave this hall to deliberate.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give another big round of applause to the debate